Will come to order. Dr. Skorton, I'd like to welcome you to today's hearing. We appreciate you joining us to share your vision for the future of the Smithsonian and discuss your budget priorities for fiscal year 2019. The members and staff are also grateful you brought some interesting historical items for show and tell. It's always one of the highlights of the hearing season. I've said this before, it bears repeating. You clearly have one of the most interesting jobs in town. As the Secretary of the Smithsonian, you're entrusted with challenging responsibility of operating and managing one of the country's most revered institutions. The Smithsonian is often referred to as America's attic because you're the steward of more than 155 million objects in a national collection that reflects America's artistic, cultural, and scientific heritage. The Smithsonian provides education, outreach programs in science, history, art, culture for visitors and scholars worldwide. It's governed by a Board of Regents consisting of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Vice President, 9 private citizens, 6 members of Congress, including our good friend here, Tom Cole, who serves on the subcommittee. I understand you guys had a meeting yesterday.
We did.
Overall, the proposed funding level in the Smithsonian fiscal year 2019 budget is $957 million. The budget request supports salaries, expenses, essential facilities maintenance. It also continues the National Air and Space Museum's renovation projects and supports other critical priority construction and deferred maintenance projects. Like most large organizations, the Smithsonian faces some enormous challenges, which we'll be discussing at some length today. At the top of the list, of course, is the multi-year renovation of the National Air and Space Museum, the most visited museum in the world. As a result of the budget agreement earlier this year, the Interior Subcommittee was provided additional funding in its fiscal year 2018 allocation that enabled us to provide more than double the amount requested for this critical revitalization project. Look forward to hearing the detail on how the $198 million provided in the omnibus will be invested and what additional funds in fiscal year 2019 and future years will be required to complete this revitalization project. The recent construction of the Museum of the African American History and Culture and the proposed renovation of the National Air and Space Museum illustrate the very real challenges this subcommittee faces. There continues to be increasing demand for federal dollars to address many important and legitimate priorities. For this reason, it's essential that the Smithsonian clearly outline and communicate its highest and greatest priorities throughout the appropriations process. Secretary Skorton, I pledge to you the last time we met, this subcommittee will do its very best to address the subcommittee's most urgent priorities. We support your outstanding efforts, and we look forward to your testimony and continuing our work together. Now I'm happy to yield to my good friend on our subcommittee's ranking member, Mrs. McCollum, for any opening remarks she would like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning. Good morning, Secretary. Welcome to the subcommittee. It's been 2 years since you last testified before us, and I'm pleased to see you here, and I am very excited to hear about the treasures that you brought and to also hear about the progress you've made at your accomplishments at the Smithsonian. And I think that from the chair's statement, and you'll hear from my statement, there's something that we 100% agree on, and that is the Smithsonian, the special place it has on the Mall and in our nation. So 2 months ago, Congress passed a bipartisan budget agreement to increase non-defense discretionary spending for 2 years. And 3 weeks ago, in an admirable show of bipartisanship, fiscal year 2018 omnibus was enacted into law. So within that omnibus, Congress made significant investments in the Smithsonian by providing, as the chair pointed out, $198 million for the restoration of the Air and Science Museum, which fully funded your 2018 request for the museum's restoration, and most of what you're requesting for the fiscal 2019 budget. But as we all know, more work remains to be done, and the total federal share of the National Air and Space Museum is going to reach $650 million. And to date, $250 of that million has been appropriated. Furthermore, the Smithsonian's overall facilities condition index rating from the National Research Council is considered poor, and the Smithsonian's backlog of deferred maintenance and repair is estimated at $8 billion. The Smithsonian must continue to address this backlog in order to improve the facility's indication index score to ensure a healthy, safe environment for visitors, staff, and one special place where you even care for animals. So we have to be working with you constantly to make sure that there's responsible stewardship for your vast collections. In addition, the cost of maintaining bricks and mortars, you have a responsibility to the federal staff inside of these buildings. Mr. Chair, there was a report. I'm going to see if we can get a full copy of it because we do oversee salaries, of how far behind federal employees have become in salaries and wages in that here for many of our institutions. So the fiscal year 2019 budget for salaries and expenses is $738 million, which is $9 million above the enacted level, and I want to see how we're fitting in, especially in the Smithsonian, and addressing what the reports were about employees' wages. The Smithsonian was created for the increase in diffusion of knowledge. It has the ability to capture the imagination and curiosity of both children and adults, and it has something for everyone. I want to commend you, however, for your recent launch of the American Women's History Initiative. I'm pleased that Congress has provided $2 million in the recent omnibus towards that effort. While the focus on the history of American women, I believe, is far-reaching, beyond what it even will accomplish in the United States. I believe you will inspire women and girls with this initiative all over the world. The Smithsonian Institution is beloved by millions and is one of the most visited museums in the world. You had over 3 million visitors to your newest museum, the National Museum of African American Culture and History. What a wonderful resource for people to learn about the rich and cultural experience and history and the vibrant African American community here, and those of African American descent can take great pride in their history, as we also tell the history with great accuracy and sadness at times. I'm pleased that you completed a $1.5 billion fundraising campaign last year. That success is an indication of the value you place on this, that you place in communicating its importance to the public. So the public support for your mission and your attempts to explore new and innovative activities is one that is supported not only by Congress, but by the American people. So, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate the work that you do, the work that all the employees at the Smithsonian do to advance the civic, educational, scientific, and artistic life of this nation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. With that, Dr. Skorton, I'm happy to yield to you time for opening statement.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McCollum and members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for this opportunity. And on behalf of the entire Smithsonian Institution, our 6,500 employees and our 17,000 volunteers, we appreciate the continued and very generous support of Congress, which allows us to make important contributions to the American people through history, art, culture, science, and education. And today, with our numerous museums and distinguished scholars and in-depth research, iconic treasures, excellent education programs, and vast array of information made accessible through digital media, the Smithsonian remains a trusted source of information and inspiration for the people of America and the world. The Smithsonian will continue to strive to be an effective steward of our past and prove to be a wise investment in the future. Since I last testified before this subcommittee, we've unveiled a new strategic plan that will guide us through the year 2022. My written statement goes into more detail about the plan, but I'd like to briefly focus on a few key points that illustrate how it will make us a stronger and more responsive institution. One of the goals of the strategic plan is to reach new audiences, both beyond the National Mall and here in the nation's capital. From the National Air and Space Museum's 2-week STEM camp for girls to the National Museum of Natural History's intensive youth engagement through science internship program, Smithsonian education programs make a difference in and around the District of Columbia. We plan to increase our local impact by reaching all D.C. public school students with our rich educational content. We are currently in discussion with the D.C. public school system about providing them material that aligns with their curricula, helps support students' needs, and improves equity and access to educational material. Doing so would allow us to forge stronger bonds with the local community and provide a template to take more of our scholarly content to schools nationwide. Much of what we do already reaches Americans in their own homes and classrooms. For instance, our Smithsonian Science Education Center has developed a tested STEM curriculum for K-8 students, and this curriculum is currently used in 1,500 school districts in every state and more than 20 other countries. The Museum on Main Street program from our Smithsonian Traveling Exhibition Service allows us to reach rural America through museum exhibitions, research, educational resources, and programming. And thank you for bringing up the American Women's History Initiative. This will take to the road as well, with stories of pioneers like Harriet Tubman, Amelia Earhart, and Sandra Day O'Connor. It will leverage existing museum collections and expertise with new programmatic funds. The initiative will help the Smithsonian show young women and men alike that we only reach our full economic and moral potential as a nation when we include everyone. We are also expanding our international footprint, and one big step forward in that respect is our work with the Victoria and Albert Museum to open a combined exhibition space in London and a separate space for Smithsonian self-curated exhibitions. This will be the first international exhibition spaces in our history. We look forward to the expected opening in 2023 and the tremendous capacity to help us reach new audiences. One fascinating and futuristic project underway is at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we're working with American and international partners to build one of the world's most powerful telescopes. The giant Magellan Telescope, or GMT, will use an array of 7 huge mirrors working in tandem to produce images 10 times sharper than those from the Hubble telescope. The GMT will help our scientists explore the distant reaches of the universe in our search for life beyond this planet. And more on the down-to-earth side, the National Museum of African Art recently hosted its first Morning at the Museum. This program, hosted by many of our museums, allows those with cognitive and sensory processing disabilities to take part in creative workshops in a supportive environment in a setting quieter before crowds enter the museum. As always, and as was mentioned, the safety of visitors and staff and volunteers is my first priority. I've spoken to this committee about the urgent need to renovate the National Air and Space Museum due to the risk posed by its crumbling marble facade. The project's share of our budget request underscores the importance and priority for the Smithsonian. Our focus today is also on another type of safety. Our staff must be free to work without harassment in a safe environment in which all may succeed. The quality of our training and policies to address workplace harassment is impressive. However, I am committed to self-reflection and refining all we do by re-emphasizing training compliance and examining all of our harassment policies. Ultimately, better policies will make us a better institution. For fiscal year 2019, the Smithsonian budget request is $957 million. Within this amount is $738 million for salaries and expenses. Following guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, we've included an increase of $13.4 million for facilities maintenance needs, for fixed cost increases, and for restoration of a rescission in the fiscal 18 continuing resolution. We're also requesting $219 million for facilities capital, and most of that, or $127 million, will be used to continue work on the National Air and Space Museum project. We greatly appreciate the investment in this critical project in the recently enacted fiscal year 2018 omnibus bill and look forward to updating the committee as the project progresses. I'm also pleased to report that just last week I named Dr. Ellen Stoffen as the new John and Adrian Mars Director of the National Air and Space Museum. Ellen is so excited she's going to begin her tenure at the museum April 30. The future is brighter than ever for this beloved institution that I am privileged to serve. I'm confident that the Smithsonian is primed to take advantage of our opportunities in the years and decades ahead and to serve the American people even more effectively. Thank you. And I want to just very quickly tell you about our experts and some of these terrific objects you see in front of you. As was mentioned, our total collection is 155 million objects and specimens, and we have some of these treasures here today. I want to introduce Lisa Kathleen Grady, curator at the National Museum of American History. She's brought the rosewood and ivory gavel used by Susan B. Anthony to chair women's suffrage conventions. You'll notice the white gloves. Those are meant to remind me that I cannot touch the gavel. Peter Jacob, chief curator at the, there he is, at the National Air and Space Museum, brought two things: a stopwatch used by Wilbur Wright to time the historic flight by his brother Orville in the Wright Flyer on December 17, 1903, and a sample of the wood and fabric from the Wright Flyer that the Apollo 11 crew carried to the moon in 1969. And Ryan Lintelman and Theo Gonzalez, there's Ryan is in the second row, Theo Gonzalez, curators at the American History Museum have brought the custom-made silver flare trumpet of jazz great Dizzy Gillespie, and I must comment that we named our male dog Dizzy after that gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you, and if there's no objection, Tom needs to go to a hearing on his own committee. If he'd like to make a brief statement.
I just, again, want to thank Dr. Skorton for the privilege of serving as one of the regents at Smithsonian. Assure everybody here it is in good hands. The only important thing I've done since I've been there was be part of the group that interviewed and selected Mr. Skorton to be the head. And you've got his bio, so you know what a distinguished record he has as an academic leader and president of one of our leading institutions, and frankly, having been president of another one before that. So it's just a genuine pleasure to have you here. It's a genuine pleasure. This committee does, as I know you know, take this responsibility very seriously, and frankly in a very bipartisan way, and with a great deal of pride in what the men and women you lead at the Smithsonian have accomplished. So again, I can just assure my colleagues the institution has been well led throughout its tenure, but I really believe you have in front of you the most distinguished of the secretaries that we've had, and we're very fortunate to have him in charge of what's really a national treasure and a national jewel at a critical point in its development. So I'm going to excuse myself, but again, I just wanted to be here and say hi to you, and thank you again personally for all you do.
Thank you, Dr. Cole, for all you do and all the regents do, and thank you for getting down to candidate 27 or whatever it was when you hired me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Doctor, as you mentioned in your opening statement, the revitalization of the National Air and Space Museum, which we all worked on. We visited the museum and saw for ourselves the problems that are there. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, it's the most visited museum in the world, I guess, even more than the Louvre. Is that?
It's always neck and neck, Mr. Chairman, with the Louvre, and we squeaked by him last year, and so we're using those bragging rights.
So we say we're number one. So
number one.
Okay, so on that subject, what is the present status of the work on the Air and Space Museum? What specific work will be done with $198 million provided in the recent omnibus, and specifically what does the additional $108 million above the fiscal year 2018 budget request allow you to do in terms of advancing the project schedule?
Well, on all of our behalf, again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McCollum, and the entire subcommittee for the confidence you've shown in us. You've very materially changed the way we look at this project with this additional funding. This additional funding is allowing us in a very confident way to push ahead with the project. We're able to purchase materials, steel, glass, marble, and we're able to confidently begin to let subcontracts and to push ahead. We hope to do that in a way that will be efficient, that will minimize disruptions, and allow us to do this in as quick a job as possible. The work is well underway on the project. One of the very first things we have to do is prepare the specimens. As I mentioned in our past discussions, we're going to do this in 2 phases, starting with the west part of the building and move the objects or protect the objects, work on the reconstruction there, and then swap over to the east part of the building. In order to do that, we have to remove some of the artifacts. They're precious, irreplaceable artifacts. Some will be moved out to the Udvar-Hazy area near Dulles. Others will be protected in place in the institution, so that's well underway. And contractors are developing what we're calling mock-up components to test performance of the exterior facade before it's put in place to last, hopefully, for a very, very, very long time. And it's also enabled contractors to begin to let subcontracts and lock in costs now against the possibility of inflation. So again, I thank you. You've allowed us to take a different approach to this project and do it confidently and do everything we can to make sure it doesn't get out of bounds on either schedule or cost. So thank you.
You might want to fix your cost on steel. It's maybe going up.
I'm just a student of what's going on in our world, but we have terrific people watching it, and we have confidence in the bid process to keep us on budget.
And just a point on this, as you know, the building was completed in 1976. The development and the construction of that project are probably no longer with us today. But I'm hoping 42 years from now, I don't know if I'll be here, but I hope that it's a better outcome than what we had in 1976, where we don't have to revisit this 42 years from now.
Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, nothing would make, I know I've mentioned this before, so please bear with me if I mention it again. The original project was done with the expectation that in equilibrium we'd have about 2 million visitors a year. 7 months into the first year, we'd already had 5 million visitors. And we have over 7 million visitors a year. So the systems themselves quickly got worn out. And we've known for some years that we had to replace the systems, the HVAC, everything around them. But it got to the point now where, since we're going to do the project in total, we would also replace the systems. So we will do the work on the systems expecting and anticipating the very large visitorship that we now realize is part of our everyday life at that museum. And secondly, we've learned our lesson in terms of the facade, the marble facade, the cladding, and we will avoid any ways that were thought of with all good intentions in the past to maintain the overall envelope of cost for the project. We will spend the extra funds with your support to make sure that it's done in a way that it will last a very, very long time. So we're very cognizant of that. And again, I hope we're here 42 years from now to confirm that.
Great. I would hope you are. Ms. McCullum.
Mr. Chair, I'll be 105. I might be there, but I won't be serving in Congress. I can guarantee that. I'm going to. Oh no, I've turned that down a couple of times. Love the House. I'm going to ask you to get back on some questions that have come up about parking. Parking's at a premium, and you're having to do things down in the garage. In fact, Mr. Chair, we even toured the garage when we were down there. So to see how that's going, or if there's anything we have to do working with Capitol Police or other things with the architect of the Capitol to make sure that parking is working for everyone down there as you move forward. But what I wanted to talk on are 2 things. One is the deferred maintenance backlog. And if you could tell us how the F-18 funding for fiscal year 18 has helped you or not helped you with your 2019 project list. Kind of give me a little update on the zoo and how you're going about prioritizing all this work with such a huge project that you are undertaking at the National Air and Science Museum. But I wanted to go back to something that had been deferred maintenance that's not totally open yet and find out where we are, and that's the Arts and Industry Building. The building was closed for renovations for almost a decade before it was reopened in 2016. Part of the announcement that the Smithsonian had was that it was going to be a building for short-term exhibitions. and Rachel Goslings is the director that's been working on that. And when you appointed, when you did the announcement and appointed her, and because I'm looking for the quote, you said that the building, quote, would be a place for educating and inspiring Americans about the impact of creativity and the innovation in our society, and will become a laboratory to try new things, new technologies, new approaches to better engage the millions of Americans visiting the National Mall and Smithsonian each year. And that's what you said, and I know that you did something very innovative with the building when we had the Folklife Festival on the Circus Arts. Circus Juventus from St. Paul, Minnesota was performing in this space, and I'll tell you, when people walked in to that space, including myself and other Minnesotans that we directed down there, they had lots of questions about the history of that building, how it was going to be used. They thought the energy in that building is, the circus added a lot of energy in the building, but the energy in that building, the light and just the colors and everything is so different from anything else you experience on our nation's mall. But I'm kind of concerned because we haven't heard about that much lately. You've got your deferred maintenance backlog. You've got the Air and Space Museum working on. So could you fill us in, because my constituents are asking, including Circus Juventus at times when I see them, what are the next steps for the arts and industry building? And are you having fundraising campaigns? You know, what can we do to lend our voice and our support as you build enthusiasm for this very special museum to make sure it's not forgotten on the mall?
Thank you very, very much, Ms. McCollum. First of all, on the parking issue, I must say in every organization I've worked in and had the privilege to lead, parking has been a main issue, and it's certainly a big issue for us. And the change in parking availability related to the National Air and Space Museum project is a huge challenge. I don't have a complete answer for you today on that. We're working on it. We're looking for availability of other parking, very concerned about serving our employees, and I pledge to keep in touch with you personally about this. On the issue of deferred maintenance and the omnibus spending bill, first I want to repeat, and I can't say this enough times, we're endlessly grateful to what you've done for us by helping us with the Air and Space project. It is the most visited museum in the world, and it's sorely in need of revitalization, as we call it. And so we're very, very grateful. Having said that, there was the requirement, as you know, to reduce our facilities capital in other areas by a certain amount of money. I believe it was $24 million. And so that has definitely caused us to defer or to delay or even reduce planned projects, as you mentioned, at the National Zoological Park, at Suitland, at our collection center, at the National Museum of the American Indian, and other areas. I don't envy the decisions that you have to make, and none of this in any way clouds the gratitude that I and my colleagues feel. But we do need to keep our eye on the ball on other maintenance projects. Our amount of funding, which has been stable and for which I'm very, very grateful, is about half of the amount that industry standards say we should be spending. We should be spending 2% or more of our installed base of buildings for maintenance. And we are asking in our request for fiscal 19 a $5 million increase in that aspect of the budget toward hopefully an eventual increase in deferred maintenance. In the meantime, we're keeping ourselves busy by having a very careful prioritization of those deferred maintenance projects, using health and safety as our #1 priority criterion, and then after that thinking about the public interface and wanting to deal with the public in the best way possible. In terms of the Arts and Industries building, that building is the apple of our eye. It's a chance to do something different than we can do elsewhere on the mall. Blame me for the long time it's taken to come to an announcement in public what we're doing. It's not Rachel Gosling's, it's none of my colleagues behind me. I've been working to raise philanthropic money to kick us off, as you say, on a campaign. I've been spending a lot of time on it. I have high hopes that pretty soon I'll be able to give some good news. I don't have that good news today. But should good fortune smile on us and we're able to move the philanthropy along, we will have, in all likelihood, 4 different types of activities in the building. #1, we will have an area of focus, and it will most likely be about the future. The Smithsonian is very much focusing, as you know, on the present and the glorious past of our country, as these beautiful artifacts show you. But we also think that the scholarly capabilities of the Smithsonian and the ability to tell stories should allow us to engage the public spirit and imagination about the future. So that would be one aspect. Secondly, just as you mentioned, the idea of a place to try things, a sort of an innovation lab for anything in the Smithsonian Institution. So if a museum director or a research director or an education director wants to try another way of interacting with the public, this would be a great space to do that. Thirdly, we will continue to use that space for some special events as they come up. And then finally, so-called pop-up exhibits that other museums may want to do there. It's great to have that space. Make no mistake, though, the building will eventually need a complete rehab, and the day may come that we approach this subcommittee and ask about changing the priority of possible funding of that. But the first thing that I'm committed to do is to see what we can do with private funding, and I have hopes that we can bring you some good news. And all I can do today is tell you that I'm working on it, and don't blame Goslins, blame Skorton, why we haven't told you yet. Thank you.
Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, it's nice to see you today.
Me too, thank you.
You're not unlike other people who come before this committee where you have many problems chasing limited dollars. Can you describe the consequences if you failed to receive the funding you needed in February or in fiscal year 19 for this Air and Space project?
Thank you, Mr. Joyce, and it's good to see you again as always. 2 years ago, I was asked what would happen if the country, for good and understandable reasons, was not able to support the project, and we would have to close the museum at some point because the health and safety issues related to the cladding. You may notice that there already are some covered walkways in certain areas where we are concerned about a special vulnerability of the public should something actually move out of the cladding and fall. And so it's very, very, very important. However, I think you're asking me a tougher question, and that is what would happen, although you've already been very generous with us and we are moving along, if you couldn't help us with the $127 million or keep things going. We would have to slow down the project to some extent. I think in the long run, it would be our problem, but it would cost us more money to do that because of unavoidable cost increases. We do have fixed cost increases, of course, every year, and we're asking for some additional help with that in our appropriations request. But I think that the country would be served in the most cost-efficient way if somehow you could find, in all the tough decisions you have to make, a way to get us to that 650 as quickly as possible. We believe that the more quickly we can get there, the more quickly not only can we give the American public essentially a new National Air and Space Museum, but we can avoid cost overruns, which would put us in a situation that would allow us, that would force us to cut corners and go backwards on what the chairman asked me in terms of keeping this solid for a very, very long time. And then the one other thing that I would mention is that other projects that we do need to do, as the ranking member mentioned, I view National Air and Space as so much by far our first priority that those other priorities would have to take a further back seat to this, which would be unfortunate because of the enormous visitorship in the other museums as well. Thank you for asking me that.
No, but I understand you also saying that the physical plant, the HVAC, the other things in the facility, while in need of repair, that's all been held off to do the major redo hopefully the major redo and do them all at once, which is obviously wise, but do you have an expected life out of those? I mean, is it about near the end of their useful life? Is it your system's about to break down?
Well, it varies with the particular system that you're talking about. We have known for some time that we would have to replace those systems. Some of them are getting closer to the point where it will be an urgent matter. And just as you said, sir, it's important, we thought, to try to do the whole project as one, because that would be more cost efficient. And we also had another idea, which was the idea of our fabulous immediate former director of the museum, General Jack Daly, and that was, in addition to the systems, and in addition to the envelope, if you will, the roof, the cladding, the glass, the steel, that we want to give America 23 new galleries. So we're in the process, I am in the process of raising $250 million of philanthropic money to pair with the $650 million of public money. We are about $70 million, a bit over a quarter of the way there. And I believe that the combination of your confidence in us and confidence in the importance of the museum has allowed me to raise more money more vigorously on the philanthropic side, because they say, well, at a very difficult time in terms of federal spending, the federal government is investing in this, must be a high priority. I too will want to invest with it. And I hope that it also shows you that we are taking seriously our responsibility to do everything we can to bring non-federal dollars to the table as well. So at the end of the day, we would have new systems, new envelope, and 23 new galleries for the American public. And as I mentioned, there were about $70 million toward that 250. And the board of the National Air and Space Museum, which is peopled by some of the great leaders in the American aerospace industry, they're just a house on fire. They're just doing a fabulous job of not only themselves contributing funds, but helping to open doors for me so that we can get more people to do it. And I'm very confident that we'll break the tape on that.
Well, you know, our chairman, who is himself a wise man who's very frugal, our only CODA last year was to your facility, where we got the chance to walk around and see all that you're doing. I was impressed by the fact, and it's sad, but it's true, unfortunately, in these day and age, that the needs for security and what you would have to do to move things outside and change some of the structural features for how people enter and leave the museum for the safety of all concerned. And that wasn't lost on me, but let's step to the zoo. There is, can you explain to me what your plans are for any security there where people can walk in and out and access to, again, a lot of visitors, and there's no metal detection, and from what I understand, not even a skeletal police force?
Well, thank you for asking another tough and very important question, Mr. Joyce. So one of the things that keeps me up at night, other than various orthopedic issues, is trying to thread the needle and find that sweet spot between security for our visitors, for our staff, for our volunteers, on the one hand, and openness and access to these institutions. You will find that recently during spring break and during the crush of humanity to enjoy the Cherry Blossom Festival, that just before opening time, the lines to our museums and the mall were huge, sometimes around the corner, going around the block. And the reason those lines are long is two reasons. One is that a lot of people want to enjoy these museums, and it's very, very gratifying. 25 million visitors last year. But the other reason is that Mr. Horvath and others, the head of our Office of Protection Services, a wonderful professional, Gene O'Toole, in trying to find a way to thread that needle, have had to up our game in security. America expects us to give them a safe environment. And our biggest challenge in that regard is the openness of the National Zoo. And Mr. Horvath and I and Officer O'Toole are spending a lot of time trying to find the optimal solution for that, which would allow openness, allow people to enjoy the open environment of the zoo. Clearly, we have work to do to optimize that, as we do everywhere throughout the institution. So I'm very glad, if you wish, to bring more detailed and granular details to you. I'd be honored to talk to you about it, or to anybody on the subcommittee, as would Mr. Horvath, as would Officer O'Toole.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Pingree.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Skorton, for being here today and
Thank you
for
having me.
bringing the wonderful treasures and your team with you, and also the great work you do to protect this national treasure and expand it and keep it alive and everything else. It's a big job.
Thank you so much.
But it's what makes Washington, D.C. a wonderful city to visit and a great place for families, and we see that in this time of the year where it's just crowded everywhere, so that's good. I want to just take a little different tack about some of the outreach that you do. I'm very pleased to see that your 2022 strategic plan includes an ambitious vision for expanded outreach, and I know I've learned a little bit about that before, and coming from a state like Maine that has limited resources. Yet we've also seen how arts and humanities have really turned around some of our communities that have, lost an important mill, or fishing has gone down, or something else that really is an important part of change. So I'd just like to hear more about it, about your goal, about what's available today, what's being taken advantage of, and what we could do more to promote, and how we can better use it. So,
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kindness. And if I might just digress for just a quick moment, you see the treasures before you on the table, and people are giving me a lot of credit today. But the other treasures that we have that really make the place work are the people behind me, those in the row immediately behind me, and those, the 17,000 behind them. So thank you very much for your kindness. And thank you for opening up the topic of outreach. Please cut me off if I blab too long. This is very, very close to my heart. So we're going to pursue outreach in two different directions that are quite disparate. One is we believe that every nonprofit owes extra effort to its hometown, so to speak. And so we're going to reach into the city of Washington in many ways. And I mentioned already that we're going to reach out to every K through 12 student in the DC public school system. And I have a youth advisory council that's comprised of DC teenagers as well as those from 5 other communities in the eastern half of the country. I met with them yesterday evening. And I think that outreach to young people in town is very, very important. Now, in terms of national and international outreach, we have multiple mechanisms, and I'll just quickly outline a couple of them, not to go on too long. We have 216 affiliate museums. We are in 46 states, Puerto Rico and Panama. These affiliates are owned and operated locally. They're not formally part of the Smithsonian. We don't request funding for these museums. But we share expertise, we share experts, we share, on occasion, collections, and we learn from them as they learn from us. And I want to give you one example of one of the things we're doing that links to the second, and that's the traveling exhibition service. We're coming up to a major celebration, 50th anniversary of the moon landing next year, 2019. And we are going to take the moon capsule and send it around the country. Those of you who were around then, and I was, remember that NASA did a victory lap the year after the moon landing and took that all over the United States. And we're going to do a mini Smithsonian version of that victory lap, take it to 5 cities. It's going to end up on the actual day of the commemoration at one of our affiliates in Seattle, the Museum of Flight, which, if anybody happens to be in Seattle, is a breathtaking, fabulous museum. And so we're going to combine those two kinds of outreach, affiliate outreach and the outreach of the Traveling Exhibition Service. Then there's a subset of the Traveling Exhibition Service, which I'm very proud of, having lived in small towns for much of my life, and that is the Museum on Main Street program that reaches out to rural communities. And so a very small community, we've had one outreach to a community with less than 800 population. They can have a Smithsonian exhibition in their town, thanks to the Museum on Main Street program. I thank you, Ms. Pingree, for bringing up the issue of the arts and humanities. I'm a physician and a scientist, and yet I believe our most profound societal problems are not going to be solved by science alone. It's necessary but not sufficient. And we emphasize and have enormous expertise in the arts and humanities, in art, culture, history, anthropology, and so on. And I think the arts and humanities are unbelievably important for us to understand ethics, to understand ourselves and the world around us, and to understand what it means to be fully human. And if I can digress one more moment, on May 7th, I will be at a press conference at the National Academy of Sciences. As an individual, I've chaired a study for the National Academies about reintegrating the arts and humanities and the sciences in higher education. And I would very much appreciate any feedback members of the subcommittee have when learning about that. It's a big issue for the higher education community. So thank you. Outreach is a big, big deal for us.
Great. Well, thank you very much for what you do and for explaining a little bit more about that to me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Some discussion about, obviously, your ambitious multi-year campaign that you've been going through for the next number of years to raise money. I was curious, what was the initial goal of the campaign, and how much have you actually raised so far, and how soon do you think you'll be able to raise the balance of those funds?
Thank you. Well, I've had the great privilege of doing a lot of fundraising for a lot of different kinds of organizations, community organizations, faith-based organizations, you name it. And coming to the Smithsonian, Chairman, I wondered, without a football team that I know about, I'm still learning about Smithsonian, but without a football team And without alumni in the usual sense, would people be generous to the Smithsonian, especially knowing the generosity of the U.S. Congress? And it's breathtaking what this campaign produced. The goal originally was $1.5 billion, and I take very little credit for this campaign. It was kicked off by my wonderful predecessor, Dr. Wayne Clough, and the American public helped us blow by that goal. We reached $1.88 billion, and two statistics I'd like to share with the subcommittee that I'm very proud of. One is that 93% of the gifts in the campaign were $100 or less. 93% of the gifts were $100 or less. So a lot of people who have their heart in the right place and have limited capacity were able to be a part of the Smithsonian. One example of that is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. When it set up a membership program, the entry-level membership was $25. So quickly, about 100,000 people were able to say to themselves and be members of this museum. The other end of the spectrum is that 356 people gave $1 million or more each. So we got to $1.88 billion, and we are going to continue to do very robust fundraising. Again, I return to the National Air and Space Museum project, that's going to be, again, like the whole Smithsonian throughout its history, a public-private partnership, and that's why we're so devoted to raise and even exceed that $250 million.
Great job. Ms. McCullough.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm glad Ms. Pingree asked about the creativity aspect of it, because we talk a lot about STEM here in Washington, D.C., but when I'm at home in Minnesota, we talk about STEAM, because we add
Yes.
the arts, because
Yes.
all the wonderful things that you brought today had, either a connection with the humanities or the arts,
Yes.
whether it's standing up for women's rights, as the gavel does, or music is arts and humanities, and then some of the engineering and science that we see in our higher education institutions, and I'm proud to have 22 of them in my district. We're the envy of the world with our higher education, because we do have that creativity, that thinking outside of the box. But I'm going to go back to bricks and mortar, because that's pretty much what the chairman and I are trying to figure out how to make work for you. And I appreciate, it sounds like you spend all your time fundraising, and I know you don't, because you're very on top of the day-to-day managements, but I'm going to ask about the South Mall campus. You've been working on a redesign for several years now, and for those who might not be familiar with where the South Mall campus actually is, it's the Castle, the Hirshhorn, the Freer, and then the Arts and Industry Building, which I was asking about before. But it's several gardens that connect with the Pollinator Garden on the other side of the mall as well. So the master plan has really changed since the original concept in 2014. And you're working your way through a planning process, and the comment period on the programmatic agreement closes in May. So can you update us a little bit on how this project is going, what your estimated cost of the master plan might be, the time frame, and you didn't request anything in this year's budget for it, so that's why the curiosity has gotten to me on this. So maybe it's because you're waiting for it and we're going to have a big ask in the next budget. So bottom line is, I know you're out there privately fundraising for a lot of things, but what's kind of your public-private match on the South Mall campus?
Thank you. Very, very important set of questions. Let me first start by just reminding myself and all of us what a master plan is. It's not a specific project that's ready to bring to the subcommittee or ready to bring to a planning commission. It's a general concept of where we have to get a general destination for changing things. And we need to do some rethinking of the visitor experience in the entire South Mall area, how people can approach these museums from the mall side, from Jefferson Drive, how they can approach from Independence, how they interconnect with each other, how we load things, stuff that goes to the different areas, how many loading docks we have, how we have the support functions, the systems, electrical and so on for the entire area. And that was part of the idea of having a master plan. Again, that I give the credit to Mr. Horvath and to Wayne Clough. Now, we've gone through several alternatives, as you mentioned, and the plan has evolved. We've settled on alternative F as a specific way that we think the master plan should go. And I did not come today prepared with a lot of details or schematics about the master plan, but I'm very glad to follow up at your request with you personally or with the subcommittee to remind you exactly what alternative F is. I've heard more about the Hauptgarten than anything in this project, and I'm very glad to have heard it. And I appreciate that you mentioned a pollinator area. To burden you with one piece of personal information, my wife and I are beekeepers, and I've been stung more than she has, but that's my clumsiness. But I'm very, very engaged with the garden, and we had a schematic done by the architectural firm that we engaged to help us with the master plan, a schematic when it first came out that showed something pretty specific about what the Hauptgarten would look like. And in retrospect, I think we should not have had such a specific thing because we're not anywhere as close to having specificity. I will tell you three things about the gardens in that master plan. Number one, we are absolutely positively committed to have at least as much garden space and probably more than we had before. Number two, we're absolutely committed to make sure that the ambience of the garden and the way people can interact with it is reminiscent of and evocative of the wonderful sense that people get going out there, including myself. My immediate office window and the office window for my support staff looks right out on the Hauptgarten, and I go out there frequently on some pretext just to get a little taste of that garden. But thirdly, it's a roof garden, and it's leaking, and something does need to be done to redo the structure so that it will no longer leak on the areas below. And so, like the question that was asked about doing the systems for air and space and the cladding and the galleries, in this way as well, we want to tackle it in a systematic fashion that will allow us to do the right thing by the roof leak, do the right thing by the garden and the many, many people who love the garden, including me, and also do everything else that we need to improve for the long term the experience. We're not prepared to give you anything like a specific number today. It will be in excess of $1 billion by the time all is in. The castle itself is a very, very big project that we have to get to at some point. And we're glad to develop a briefing, if you like, just on the master plan and share details with you. But we're interacting carefully with the public bodies that are involved in approving aspects of it, and very glad to come back and share more details with you.
Mr. Chair, there is nothing more controversial than what someone's garden should look like, because we all have our own vision. As a person who lost having a whole yard to garden down to a window box, which gets changed frequently, I might add. I appreciate the fact that what you're saying about the focus all became on the gardens there for a while and not everything else done. I think when you're talking about, looking at whole systems and replacement of HVACs and that, as Mr. Joyce put up, I think sometimes what would be helpful for the committee when we're looking at that would be, the savings in doing the ductwork right for the first time for energy, for what systems are going to be in the future. Because sometimes ductwork radically changes, and it can change the space inside of a building. And how you can use that, and then the energy savings that you potentially see. I know when you mentioned having the right systems in place for the number of visitors that are in there on a hot day or a cold day or humid, makes a huge difference. But along with that comes energy savings, which will take it won't take your bottom line down, but it will help with inflation and increased costs into the future. I think sometimes letting us know some of that's all been thought out would be very helpful, not only to us, but the public who might have a question on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
If I may just comment quickly and make it quick. Thank you for bringing those items up. I'll pledge to you that Mr. Horvath and I will develop a specific briefing related to the two matters that you brought up, especially sustainability and energy savings. It turns out that we're engaged in a very significant initiative for that. Coming up in just a few days, we're going to be celebrating LEED certification of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and we have LEED certification of the Anacostia Community Museum and other parts of our campuses. And it's very, very important to us, both from the point of view of doing the right thing, but also, as you say, for long-term cost savings. So we'll develop a briefing for you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Joyce, do you have an additional question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no more questions, but for the record, I want to say that we traveled back and forth in the chairman's lovely automobile.
I will not comment on any interactions among the committee members. Just stay out of it.
It was first class to me.
I'm a fellow beekeeper. That
Oh, my goodness.
reminds me, Einstein once said the quickest way to destroy the human race is to destroy the bees.
Yep.
And so it's an important, it's important. So gardens are important, so I enjoy them also. One last question on the preservation of collections. Obviously, that's one of your most important roles, is to strengthen the preservation and care of these, like these objects that are before us. Your FY19 budget request continues this effort by including $69.8 million within the salaries and expense account for strengthening the Smithsonian collections. This is obviously a great interest to members. Can you describe the efforts taken in recent years to improve preservation, care for the Smithsonian collections, and what does the proposed funding in the budget request allow you to do in the coming year?
Thank you. So we're taking a very systematic approach to this, and it has multiple components, and I'll try to be brief. It's a very involved issue. As time goes on and as we expand to reach 1 billion people a year, which is our goal, and as we do a better job of telling the story of women in America, Latinos in America, and everyone, we will certainly add to this already staggering size of the collection. So we really have two sets of issues. One set of issues is how do we protect these absolutely irreplaceable objects? There's no coming up with another watch that clocked the first human flight. And so we're doing that in a systematic way. And as you're aware, Mr. Chairman, I very much appreciate you bringing it up, not all of our collections, storage, and preservation areas are up to the standard that we believe they should be. We're about a third of the way toward design of Pod 6, which we mentioned before, and hopefully the time will come that we can get some assistance to make Pod 6 a reality. But one area is having the approach, and one area is having the actual space to do it. The second issue will be for new collections that come in, and we will have more collections even in addition to the staggering number that we have now. It's hard to predict what our needs will be for collections management until we know what those objects are. And so 140 million plus of our objects are biological specimens, and that obviously requires one certain type of collections environment. And then the Enola Gay or these papers or Dizzy Gillespie's trumpet require a different type. They all require careful protection from the elements. They all require temperature and humidity controls of various types. And we're utilizing those funds to move along in a systematic way to upgrade the facilities that we have and continuing design work that you've supported for us to move toward a day where we have Pod 6 online. Thank you for asking that.
I've always been intrigued on your inventory system that you must have. I always remember the movie, The Indiana Jones, when they had the Ark of the Covenant and they were in a box in the back of a warehouse someplace. And I know in great specificity, you know everything that's in these warehouses. Is that correct?
I didn't hear you. You're breaking up. I will tell you that they let me do some backstage stuff, as you can imagine. And when I get there and I start sort of nosing around the drawers, in a very polite, respectful way, they say, "Why don't you sit over there? We'll just bring the stuff to you." But thank you. It's very much like the movie.
Yeah. Thank you. And if there's no additional questions, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much.